ambivalent. So the result here then is frequent tensions between the WHO and the board, and these are exacerbated by the INCB's mandate regarding the 1988 Convention. Again, this is something that Chris mentioned. So for example, in the case of ephedrine, this is listed as an essential medicine by WHO, yet it's also controlled as a precursor under Table 1 of the 1988 Convention. And so this can be regarded as another example of structural tensions. And again, this speaks to the issue that Chris mentioned earlier, these inconsistencies and a lack of clarity around the conventions and classification of drugs within them. So if that's a structural example of tension, we can also see other more proactive examples of this tendency towards mission creep on the issue of scheduling. And then when we look at this, it's not just issues to do with the INCB, it also raises issues to do with the mandate of the CND itself. And so mindful of the clear lack of mandate in relation to the Single Convention and the 71 Convention, the board is quite careful not to openly call for the international scheduling of substances. So what it does is it engages more in a passive-active approach that influences debates and effectively circumvents the WHO within the scheduling process. And we can see this in a number of specific examples, including that of CAT. But I think for, in terms of the timing here this week, it's useful to focus on two drugs, dronanabol and ketamine. And as Anne mentioned, both of these are key to discussions here. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of detail just so that we can contextualise the current discussions that are going to go on, well, they have been started today and are going to continue with regard to resolutions later on in the week in the committee of the whole. So as you're all probably aware, cannabis is included under the strictest provisions of the Single Convention. I'm sure you've all seen this. Mark's publication? Okay, so and we would argue that it's erroneously being scheduled in such a way, but nonetheless that is the state of affairs at the moment. While that's the case, one of its most active ingredients, THC, is listed in Schedule 1 of the 71 Convention, and the scheduling of dronanabol, an isomer of THC, has been the topic of much, although periodic and fluctuating debate for a number of years. So it was moved from its original schedule from 1 to 2 in 1991 1991, and then there was another critical review in 2002 where the WHO considered that the drug should be rescheduled to Schedule 4. And this is where we start to see the CND behaving quite strangely. If you remember the period, this is around the midterm review after the 1998 high-level session, well, the UNGAS and the political declaration, and the fate of dronanabol is very much tied up with cannabis and the political views of cannabis within the CND. And so at this point there were fears about sending the wrong signals with regard to cannabis. And there was a highly unusual intervention by Mr. Costa, which many of you may remember, and the issue was actually kicked into the long grass, and it wasn't actually taken to the CND specifically for a decision. It was reviewed again in 2006, and the expert committee recommended then that it be moved again, this time with a little more caution rather than to Schedule 4 to Schedule 3. And during this process, I just wanted to give this quote, the expert committee stated that its abuse liability was low since there was already a popular and widely available drug with similar properties. Guess what? That's cannabis. So in 2006, the drug was kicked. It was considered CND on the issue, and it requires a 2/3 vote at that point. But the Commission decided not to vote on the issue at all. Now, it can do that by consensus decision, but again here, it was kicked into the long grass, and I think we could safely claim here that it's the board, the CND's inability to allow science to prevail over politics. And at that point, it asked the WHO, in consultation as appropriate with the INCB, to undertake another review of the drug and its stereoisomers when more information became available. Now, in terms of mandate, I think it's difficult to see what's appropriate about involving the board at this point. But it does demonstrate the success of the INCB in positioning itself in the view of the CND as an expert body on scheduling issues. And this, as Chris said, was writ large today within the panel discussion this afternoon. Moreover, aware of the views of some countries, particularly the United States, on the issue, we've got to bear in mind the INCB's attitude towards the WHO's recommendations on substance. Both in its annual report for 2006 and its accompanying plenary statement in 2007, the board spoke out against the WHO's rescheduling recommendation. And arguably, regardless of mandate issues, this was very important in setting the tone for the debate and nations' perceptions of the drug. As we know, the saga then rumbled on. It continued. There was a hiatus resulting from a lack of funding, which Chris mentioned. The expert committee met in 2012. It revisited its critical review, and guess what? Finding no evidence, it decided that its recommendation should stand. The CND used procedural arguments again to delay the consideration of the issue, and last year, finally, amongst discontent by a group of countries, a number of nations, the Netherlands brought forward Resolution L6 this year to try and get a decision. And as I understand it, and hopefully there are people in the room here who know more about this and where we are now, there are some discussions around procedure, whether or not this will actually come to the floor to be voted on. So ketamine. The INCB has also had a very hostile approach towards ketamine, and as Chris again suggested, what the board has done very successfully is generated a certain momentum among member states with regard to scheduling the drug at the national level. The pre-review of ketamine by the expert committee in 2003 led to a critical review in 2006, and at that point the committee found that the reports of dependence in humans are very limited, and that ketamine was a widely used anaesthetic. And it's also worth noting as well that the drug is included in the WHO model list of essential medicines. And on these grounds, the committee's conclusion was that there was insufficient evidence to schedule ketamine. Now, having made this decision during the 34th meeting of the expert committee, the members learned that at the 2006 session of the CND, there had been the adoption of a resolution on scheduling the substance. So again, it's this split between the two worlds, two parts of the same world within the UN system. And furthermore, the Commission within that requested that the WHO Secretariat were to produce an updated critical review document for the next meeting of the experts committee. Nonetheless, the expert committee again repeated the previous recommendations, a decision that was reached on medical and public health grounds. And it raised concerns as well that if the drug was put under international control, access would be limited, and this would, I quote, constitute a public health crisis in countries where no affordable alternative anaesthetic is available. But while the WHO was acting according to its mandate, the CND again found this very controversial. Now, why is this the case? Well, I think we can argue quite strongly that this is at least partially explained by the actions of the INCB. Specifically the fact that for some time the board had been very energetically expressing alarm about ketamine and arguing that it should be placed under control. So after the expert committee's 2006 decision, the board campaigned, along with some states, to control ketamine through a network of national legislation that effectively circumvented the WHO and the international framework. So how did it do that? Well, as you're probably aware, it mentions year after year in the annual report its concern. But also behind the scenes in 2005, the INCB was writing letters, was sending letters to the WHO, persuading them about the misuse of the drug in trafficking, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. Now, responding to this, the board spokesman at the 2006 CND declared that the WHO was astonished that the INCB should call on states to do this. And he also noted the negative impact on availability of anaesthetics in the developing world and urged states to ignore the board's calls. So this is the WHO telling member states to ignore what the board was saying. So talk about a confused state of affairs within Vienna on this issue. Now, despite this intervention, the INCB's behaviour continued. Its annual report in 2009 drew attention to states and the widespread abuse of ketamine, particularly among the youth, and linked it also with the commission of crimes, which is familiar rhetorical devices. And as we say in the report, it's interesting linking the use of ketamine with the commission of crimes, because I think unless that crime involved not actually walking anywhere, there's not a great deal of criminal intent with the ketamine user at that point in time. But this seemed to be a successful strategy. Several CND resolutions were passed calling for the control of ketamine, and the INCB backed up these calls, urging people within different delegations to implement the resolutions. And as Chris said again, there are a number of interventions within the CND making critical statements regarding the expert committee's position. So it's true that the CND does have considerable flexibility with regard to the expert committee's recommendations. But the issue of ketamine in particular raises serious questions concerning the role in relation to scheduling, not just of the board, but as I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation, also the CND. And I think rather than me highlighting this point, it's useful to quote some documentation from the WHO. So within the critical review report on ketamine for 2012, the expert committee, which met in Tunisia, there's a section called Current International Controls and Their Impact. And the report noted, it may be argued that de facto, over the years, a situation of international control has emerged without any scientific assessment of the situation due to both CND resolutions and the INCB's continuous pressure on member states. It goes on to say, it should be mentioned that according to international drug control conventions, the CND has no mandate to conclude to international control without a WHO recommendation, and the INCB has no mandate at all. And this position is also strengthened by an expert peer review of the critical report, because this is the WHO who engages very much in peer review, unlike other parts of the international drug control system. And among other things, this notes, and I quote, strict procedures required for procurement following international control is likely to create a public health crisis in African countries. Many of the countries facing problems due to abuse or illicit trade, manufacture or diversion of ketamine have already taken control measures based on the suggestion by the INCB. It may be advisable for other countries to review their national situation and come up with control measures based on reports of abuse, diversion, illicit trafficking, and need for therapeutic use rather than international control. And I think amidst all the discussions about refocusing the regime towards health, these are very poignant words, and words that we should bear in mind in light of the Thai government's proposed L12 resolution on the prevention of diversion of ketamine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. So now we're going to shift gear a little from the international scheduling system and look at firstly a regional initiative here in the EU, and then onto our last presentation, which will be about New Zealand. So let me introduce Danilo Bellotta from the EMCCDA. EMCCDA? Did I get that right? Okay. I think you know where I mean.
Commission, we have to change this.
It's a very long acronym. And Danilo will be talking about responding to the challenge of NPS in the European Union.
Thank you very much. So when INCB asked me to talk about NPS, I considered that nobody else was available from the EMCDDA in Vienna. Because a political scientist talking about chemicals is hard to hear. However, I've been around at the EMCDA for the last 17 years. So, and before that I was at the Commission. And I was at the Commission when all this bubble burst. That was the mid-90s. And that's why probably the EMCDA and the Commission, we are in the front line in this matter. Because I remember in 95-6, at the HDG 97, there was already the issue of what to do with these, at the time they were called designer drugs, party drugs. and the NPS was not yet. But basically, it was in potency what we have today. There's some people that find a way to modify the chemical structure and to put in the market something else. But the market was still illicit, so they were competing with ecstasy, and after there were this strange stuff. Already in '97, the European Union had, in my opinion, the merit to put a legislation that had two objectives. It was called a joint action. The first objective is was to do much quicker and faster than the UN system, because we were saying that it would take 4 years, 2 years more to schedule a substance, a dangerous substance, so we want to have a very fast system. At the same time, we want to have a system that responds to scientific basis, a system that responds to risks, that link the risks of these substances, the evidence we have, with the control. And I like that. I work for a scientific organization, not a political organization, and in our strategy we say that we are evidence-based driven. And for the WHO say any scientific assessment of the drug situation is something that in Europe we would like to fight, and at the same time, around the table of policymakers, we feel a certain agreement, at least rhetorically. At least we have reached the level in which it's difficult to defend something that is not scientific based in our group. So from the '97 to today, we saw, however, a shift of the market, because producers have realized that they did not have to compete in the legal market, because there was a legal market available, and the legal market was easier and was better, and consumers liked that, because they did not have to perceive to be associated with bad stuff in the cities, with bad neighboring, and therefore in the last 5 years we have had literally a boom of this market, using two ways: internet and fancy smart shops. This has given clearly spin to the market, and we have looked at that. I tell you the numbers of the notifications of this substance from 2005, and you see the escalation. We have had in 2005 14 new compounds, 2007 17, so we were still there. 2009 we have 24. 2010 is the turning point, because we double and we go to 41 new compounds, 48 in 2011, 73 in 2012, over 80 last year. So we are clearly in a growing tendency here, because the market responds very well. There is a demand for legal highs. Our kids, our people, they like to enjoy recreational drug use if that is legally possible. That's a fact. And in fact, shops, smart shops, have grown up as mushrooms, normal I suppose, in many capitals. In certain cities there were hundreds. Poland was invaded by shops. And clearly the answer was panic.